Hi, and welcome to the lightning round Creating Interlibrary Loan Training Manuals. Title pretty much says it all. Today I'm going to provide some tips and tricks for planning and writing ILL manuals. For the scope of today's presentation, we're defining manuals as text with static images for reference. First, a little introduction to me. My name is Kelsey Milner, and I am the Resource Sharing and Cataloging Librarian at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. We provide a variety of services to our members, including a homegrown resource sharing system called SEAL that I manage. Through my work at the council, I've made tons of manuals and other training resources specifically for ILL. I wanted to take some of what I've learned when it comes to creating manuals and share that today. Here are a few things we'll cover over this training: planning your manual and some suggestions for generating images and content. I will also be sharing some good accessible practices you can incorporate into this work. Accessibility is a huge topic that could easily take up a full-length presentation, so I've also included a few additional resources at the end. This is a lot to cover in our brief time together, so the presentation will be a bit broad in scope. The very first thing we're going to talk about is planning manuals. Creating a manual from scratch can be daunting, especially when you have a lot of different workflows to cover. Starting with some basic planning can really help make the process go smoother. I usually begin by asking myself some simple questions. This helps define the scope of the manual and provides a concrete and non-terrifying place to start. The first of these questions is who? Who is the targeted audience for this manual? A different audience can change how you approach and structure the manual. It could also change the familiarity with library technology and what they are coming into the manual already knowing how to do. The next question to ask yourself is what? What do you want your manual users to walk away knowing how to do? I typically write a bullet point list of all the individual tasks that I want the manual to cover. You also need to figure out the software you're going to use to create your manual. I typically use Microsoft Word, which has some great accessibility and design tools built in. However, I've also heard of people using Google Docs, which can be great for easy collaboration and quick updates. You might also have access to other resources at your organization that could be used for this work. After defining the scope of your manual, I would recommend doing some digging to see if there's any documentation already out there. Most of us are using ILL software that has vendor training materials available. It might be helpful to look at these to see how they frame the processes that you're going to describe. This isn't to say that you should take what they've written, but it can be a helpful reference for how to structure your documentation. If you're new to making manuals in general, it can also be super helpful to look at other manuals in your organization, if there are any. As with vendor documentation, you can be inspired by what you like and then leave behind what you don't. After brainstorming on the scope of a manual, I usually make a really detailed outline of what I want to cover. It's a great way to chunk the work and make it more manageable. It also conveniently provides you with the structure that you can then use for a table of contents. Before starting to fill out the outline, we have to think about a couple of things other than the how-tos. What do we want to include in our manual? And then how should we order that content? This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but some common manual elements include an introductory page summarizing what the manual covers, a table of contents, and this is really helpful, especially if your manual is lengthy, a troubleshooting page to park quirky or otherwise unique issues, appendices where you can provide supplementary or helpful resources, and a glossary with definitions of key terms, since ILL is an alphabet soup of acronyms and new terms. So think about what elements best fit your needs based on the content that you're covering and the needs of your users. When planning your outline, you also need to think about how you want to structure the information. While the hope is that manuals will be referenced as needed, the text should also flow in a way that makes sense to the person who would be doing that work. Whenever we learn something new, we typically incorporate that and build upon previously learned information. Here's an example of the outline I did for SEAL, our resource sharing platform. This manual covers all SEAL processes from A to Z. I organized it based on general topics, and then within those topics, I added specific tasks. I tried to order them in the way that someone might actually approach this work. So for this reason, we cover searching library holdings first before going into placing requests, and then from there we go into managing requests. Of course, you can structure your outline in any way that makes sense to you. Overall, though, I have found outlines and other planning work to be a lifesaver when making manuals. Now that you have a good idea of what you want to cover, you need text. This is often the most time-consuming part of creating a manual. What I typically do at this stage is create a new document and then start copying in headings from my outline. After that, I start working through every task very carefully, typing up each step taken to complete it. I number things sequentially to make the steps easier to follow along for users. And I try to note things even if they might go without saying, like click the submit button. Basically, I try to put myself in the mindset of someone who has never used this software before and ask what the potential stumbling blocks could be. There are a few suggestions for writing style when it comes to manuals. It's recommended to use plain and straightforward language. It can also be a good idea to spell out any acronyms the first time you reference them in the text or define any terms that might be new. After I write out all the steps, I usually take some time to kind of refine everything and then test out the workflow using my steps as a guide. I did want to add one accessibility tip for generating text. For virtual manuals, some people include hyperlinks to link to internal sections or to external resources. So if you do choose to incorporate hyperlinks, it's important to create what's called a meaningful link. This means that instead of writing something like link here or more info or read more, you actually embed the link into your sentence. So just to give an example, more information is available on Southeastern's website, click here in parentheses, versus a meaningful link, which is more information is available on Southeastern's website, with that being linked. Next, I want to talk about incorporating images into your manual. These are great at illustrating a specific action within a workflow and are so helpful to those of us who are visual learners. Choosing when to incorporate an image can be tricky. You might not need an image for every step of a task, especially if it includes a lot of steps on the same screen. It might also quadruple the length of your manual. So I try to incorporate some kind of image anytime an altogether new screen appears. I also choose images for steps that might prove tricky to new users, just when their eye needs to be directed to a certain part of a screen for an action. It's important that images complement your written text rather than replace it. The workflows themselves should be explained through text as well. My strategy for grabbing the screenshots is to use the snipping tool to choose what I want to capture, and I keep all my screenshots in one folder while I'm working on the manual for easy access. So here are a few examples of ways that I've included images. This one orients users to specific parts of a screen. This is one that I inserted to below an instruction to demonstrate what the reference screen in the text looks like. And this one demonstrates what a filled-in article request looks like. You can also choose to include callouts, circles, or other shapes to draw attention to certain sections of a screenshot. I usually assign my images figure numbers. This is something you can do in Word. There's an option to add a caption and then insert a figure number automatically. And the benefit to numbering the images is that you can refer to a specific figure within the text. As far as accessibility, you should include alt text for each of your images, as well as any shapes that you choose to integrate. Alt text is text that a screen reader will read out when it comes to an image. With most word processing software, you can right-click on an image and there will be an option to add alt text. Those are some good practices. You don't have to write image or photo of. That's actually supplied by a screen reader. Keep it short and descriptive. This decorative images like logos don't need to have alt text. Screenshots of software can be tricky because they're usually conveying a complicated process. However, if that process is already described in your text, then it doesn't have to be repeated in full. You can write something like visual demonstration of borrowing request explained in step whatever. Alt text is super complicated and we don't have too much time, so I have included a resource at the end that goes into this in a little more detail. Here's where we get into manual design. Most manuals are designed for utility, not necessarily beauty, and that makes sense. However, there are a few design choices you can make that overall will help with readability. It's important to have any headings and subheadings contrast the rest of the text in some way. So to create contrast, you can use a combination of increased font size, colors, or bold lettering. Most word processing software have preset headings that you can edit to your preferred specifications. And using these headings is an easy way to make your headings consistent, with the added bonus that you can easily generate a table of contents using them. Built-in headings are also good for accessibility because they allow screen readers to easily parse through the hierarchy of a document. Font can also be an important choice. For technical documents, it is recommended to use simple, easy-to-read fonts, so no web dings here. Sans serif fonts are good fonts for manual. These are considered to be modern and minimal and clear on computer screens. Some examples of sans serif fonts include Georgia, Helvetica, Arial, Calibri, and Verdana. My favorite font is Georgia. I have no idea why. There's just something about turning 30 that makes you want to pick a favorite font. There are a couple suggestions for using color in an accessible way. One suggestion is to try not to use color as the only means of conveying something. So say, for example, you wanted to indicate, don't do something, so you make it red for stop. This can be a challenge for people who cannot perceive the color red. And you don't have to avoid using colors in this way altogether, but it is suggested to have a secondary way of conveying that information, such as through the text itself or some kind of icon. The last things I wanted to touch on were testing your manuals and updating them. Once you've finished a rough draft, it is good to go out and test your manual in the field. If someone has already experienced doing the work that is covered in the manual, it would be helpful to have them look it over and provide some feedback. Since they have a good handle on the material, they can let you know if you covered things thoroughly and explained processes well. I would also suggest, if possible, sharing it with someone new to ILL work. This could be someone who works in a different department or anyone who doesn't do this work every day. As a result, they'll be able to let you know if any steps were confusing or unclear. It can be scary to share your manual, but ultimately having that feedback, especially if there are any problem areas for users, will be really helpful. One of the tools I use before making a manual available is an accessibility checker. Basically, the checker will run through your whole document and look for potential accessibility issues. It'll then give you a list of all the things to address. Word has this checker built in, and if your software does have one, I do recommend running the checker before you make the manual widely available. So once you've completed any testing on your manual, it's ready for prime time. The last thing I wanted to go over was how often to update your manual. This can be tricky as ILL software changes at a rapid pace, and it isn't always feasible to update the manual anytime that an update occurs. You might also find that people come to you with questions about things that weren't covered in your manual. That can be really good feedback on what things to add. One thing I typically do is create a running list of changes, and then I update the manual once the list becomes long enough that it's worth a full refresh. However, you could also keep your manual as a living document. If it's a Google Drive link, you could update it as changes occur and it will automatically be current. Overall, this really depends on your work style and how much time you can devote to updating the manual. As a general rule, though, manuals regarding ILL are never going to be static. They're always going to be evolving in some way. And this is also why it can be helpful to put a date when the manual was last updated somewhere in your document. This will be helpful to users and to you. We covered a lot today in a short amount of time, so I wanted to make sure I left you with some additional resources to follow up on accessibility. So here are a few websites and resources that I found helpful in making this presentation. And I just wanted to end by saying thank you so much for attending my lightning round.